This is NEAF Talks. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the hardest working MC in the cosmos, Vincent Coulihan.
Hey, welcome again, everybody. Thank you again for being here. Our next speaker is truly a dynamic and a true leader in her field. She began her career at Goddard Space Flight Center and moved to Johnson Space Center as a mission controller. Her team supported and led efforts for the International Space Station. Presently, she's the chief of flight directors at NASA for the Artemis and the Gateway programs. Artemis being returning humans back to the moon, the Gateway being the station that we're going to be placing around the moon in support of Artemis missions. Please welcome to NEAF 2023, a warm round and a true leader and inspiration to all of us, Holly Ridings.
Thank you. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everybody's awake. You guys look like you are, which is good. So today we're going to talk some about Artemis. So we're going to kind of jump right in. Here's a picture of the moon, right? So hopefully by now everyone has heard of Artemis and NASA's plan to get back to the moon and then on to Mars. But before we get into the details, one of the things you have to consider is right now in space, there is so much going on. It's absolutely amazing. So I started my career 20 plus, almost 30 years ago, and for the first 15 years, at least in human space flight, we mostly flew two vehicles, right? The shuttle, and then we built and flew the space station, which, don't get me wrong, is a multi-element complicated vehicle, but it's nothing like today, right? About a decade ago, we started to see commercial entrants. We've had international partners with us in our low Earth orbit International Space Station for many, many years. And the barrier to entry from a technology standpoint just continues to get a bit lower and lower in a good and positive way. And there's a tremendous amount of investment going on in space as well, right? So this seems like a great opportunity for us to push out into the solar system again and onto the moon. And so why would we do that, right? We want to do technology development. We want to do it sustainably. We want to learn how to live and work in orbit in deep space and down on the surface in deep space, and then head on out into the solar system to Mars and beyond, right? One of the things to keep in mind is low Earth orbit, where our crew right now is on the International Space Station, you can get home in 6 hours. Sometimes 4, depending on where you are over the Earth if you need to get home, but you can get home in 6 hours. From the moon, it's about 4 to 6 days, depending, again, if you're down on the surface, it might take you a little bit longer because you got to wait for your ride to come overhead and get back up off the surface. Mars, 6 months, right? So we got a lot to learn before we can get all the way out to Mars and live and work sustainably. Before we talk about Artemis, I want to spend a few minutes and go back and talk about Apollo. So 50 years ago, right, we landed on the moon. Multiple missions, we learned a tremendous amount. And when you consider the technology and the capability of that day, it is an incredible endeavor that we were able to accomplish as a nation. And tomorrow, actually, a very good friend of mine and also a flight director, one of the original Apollo flight directors, Mr. Jerry Griffin, is talking. So if you're still here tomorrow, I think it's 4 p.m., I highly recommend you going and listening to one of the people that was actually in the control center when we landed on the moon. Apollo 11, Apollo 13, it's amazing. And so what did Apollo do for us, right? I mean, there's statistics out there that are, in the 60s and 70s, many PhDs. People got excited about science. You can go and look at the data, and there was a tremendous bump because of Apollo, because everyone rallied around that idea and that accomplishment. And so really, what are we trying to do today with Artemis? The first thing we're trying to do, in my opinion, is to give the United States and really the world the same kind of excitement and energy as we head out into the solar system, and this time to stay sustainably. My favorite two words at the moment are lunar permanence, right? We need to get into orbit around the moon, we need to get down to the surface of the moon, and we need to have some infrastructure that is permanent so we can use it as a springboard to head out to Mars. So we call that the Artemis generation. So if you look on the internet, all of the NASA information talks about the Artemis generation, and that is you and really everyone else in the world as we try to head out and do this amazing endeavor. So several years ago, when we were first talking about Artemis, before we flew the first Artemis mission, I was actually listening to our then administrator talk, and he's about the same age I am. And he got up on stage and somebody asked him his origin story. Why did you get into space? He's talking about what was interesting to him, and he, like me, got into space and got excited about space because of a tragedy, because of the Challenger tragedy. So I was in the 6th grade and watched Challenger happen live in the elementary school cafeteria, right? And so that spawned an entire generation of people who were interested in space, but in a I want to make it better kind of way. If you went back, right after him speaking was a general who was, several years older, and he told his origin story, and his origin story was Apollo. And it was positive, and it was exciting, and it was about sitting in front of the TV and watching us land on the moon. And so beyond all of the technical things that have to get done, keep in mind, right, what we are trying to do is inspire the next generation, the Artemis generation, and give, again, the US and the world something positive to rally around. And Artemis is going to be a big endeavor, so we're going to need that energy and that excitement. Okay, so I put this in here because it's the moon, but from a slightly different perspective. Mineral deposits. The blue is a lot of titanium, the orange is a little less titanium, and then there is basalt. And so for me, when I think about the moon, what are we going to do to the moon? We've been to the moon, right? I think about, okay, well, if I'm going to go and climb a mountain, do I climb it once and then, I'm done? Me? I don't know about you guys, but me, probably not, right? I want to do it in different seasons. I want to climb different routes. I want to look at flowers versus plants and, the geology, or mark a new trail. And so the point of that is we think of the moon and see the moon a little bit as a static item, this kind of gray thing. You look up in the sky, or the first picture I showed. But it really has a tremendous amount to offer in terms of knowledge about how we as humans can live and work in space, about our solar system, and again, about what it's going to take to make it sustainable and head out into the solar system. And so the moon from a different perspective. All right, so this chart right here is potential landing sites. So now we're going to start talking a little bit about how we are beginning to construct Artemis and the missions and the enterprise. So Artemis is a lot of things to a lot of people. When you use the term Artemis, you can use it about the mission, Artemis 1, the mission we flew last November that splashed down in December. And we'll talk about that mission in a minute. But people also use it kind of as a big word, meaning all things exploration that NASA is doing around the moon. And so that's actually a great way to use it because it involves the science community, the technology community. International partners are a big part of what we're doing with Artemis. Commercial partners are a big part of what we're doing. And specifically, as we go along, you'll hear me mention some examples of that. And so this right here, what came from a tremendous amount of work in the scientific community trying to figure out the best place to go on the moon in terms of learning new and interesting things. So this is the South Pole, and these are the potential landing sites that are being discussed. We won't pick a landing site until it gets much closer. Some of it has to do with the time of year you launch and the trajectory that you fly. So you can't get to every landing site on every mission. And so what will happen is we'll narrow down the launch date, and then when we have the launch date, or that launch window really, we'll see what sites are inside that launch window, and then we'll go and kind of pick the best one. Now the South Pole is really interesting. It's also really challenging. So when they went to the moon on Apollo, they did the equator, right? And I actually saw Jerry yesterday, and he may talk about this tomorrow. They didn't have enough performance to get to the poles, right? The rocket that we're using, more performance. The second stage that pushes us out towards the moon, more performance. And so now we have the opportunity to go to the pole. But the poles are really challenging, right? The equator, you get lots of sun. Up on the poles, it's really dark a lot of the time. And when it's really dark on the moon, it's also really cold. And so people are working very hard, large groups of folks all over the world, to try to figure out some of those technology items that we need in order to do a good job of keeping our crew safe when we go and land near the South Pole. And so my favorite one of those is a group called Survive the Night. Sounds a little bit like zombie apocalypse, but it really means you have a rover on the surface, you have a lander, and it goes dark. And ideally, you've charged up during the day, right? Solar panels, and you have your batteries, except for that it's really cold. And the batteries really don't like the cold. So we got to figure out, how do you make batteries that can withstand that type of cold, or big enough to have enough power overnight, and build those into our surface infrastructure in order to survive the night. The other thing that's really interesting is how far you can go, right? So Apollo landing site, and they didn't go super far, right? They had a lunar rover later in the program, but they didn't go really far. Ideally, right, you would go point to point to point to point and stay on the surface longer, right? But you've got to then be able to, stop, recharge your batteries, fuel if you need it, supplies if you need it. And so there's a lot of discussion going on about how to do that. How do we explore the moon? Do we want to have everything in one place? Do we want to set up sort of outposts in different locations? But Survive the Night's my favorite. So I don't know, you guys can decide which of these you like, file it away, and see what we end up picking, right? My personal favorite is the very creatively named Connecting Ridge, right? And so I'm kind of thinking Connecting Ridge is my vote. But it's tough, right? Because you got to, again, consider the light and the dark. There's a lot of big craters, and the lander that we have chosen, big, and potentially will have some challenging time landing, just like they did in Apollo when they saw some rocks and had to kind of move around right before they landed on the surface. So landing on the surface is going to be a lot of fun. Okay, so remember, Artemis is a lot of things to a lot of people. We use Artemis to name the missions, right? So Artemis 1 launched November 16th, doing it from memory, I think that's right, and splashed down December 11th, just this last fall in 2022. And so that was the very first of the Artemis series of missions, Artemis 1. And it had no crew, and its primary test was a couple of things. The first one was the first flight of the rocket, SLS, Space Launch System. So launched out of Florida at the Kennedy Space Center. So this is the first time, right, that NASA had flown a rocket of this magnitude in a very, very long time. And so this was kind of the maiden flight, the test flight of the rocket. And we learned a lot of things, right? If you're familiar with rockets, they are kind of hard to launch. You have to fuel them. They get leaks. You have to figure out where the leaks are, make sure you're not leaking too much. You have to sort of fortify all your ground infrastructure, right, against the big flame coming out the bottom. We use a water suppression system as one of the many ways to deal with both the acoustic sound and the fire and smoke part of it. And so we got SLS all built and stacked. We had the Orion capsule right here, sitting on top, and we launched and spent 25 days in space. So this is a real picture, one of my absolute favorites, of our Orion capsule, obviously with a big, big view of the moon. So 25 days doing some checkouts of the system. So what did we check out? When you fly a new spacecraft, you kind of got to figure out what it's going to do. So you do a lot of testing on the ground, right? Hardware testing, software testing, have a lot of analysis about how it's going to perform. And then once you put it in orbit, you see how well you did. So the good news about Orion is it performed really well. Typically, and we've seen this with other new spacecraft we've flown in low Earth orbit, generally they perform actually a little bit better than you expect. And so your power system generates a little more power. your prop system doesn't use quite as much fuel as you predicted, that sort of thing. And so the vehicle itself was very instrumented for all of those systems. And the teams are actually going through what we call lessons learned at NASA, one of our favorite terms, to understand in detail all of the data that we were able to get back from the spacecraft. And again, this was the test flight heading into the next mission with the crew. If you look at the low Earth orbit vehicles that we've flown, the Crew Dragon, for example, we did a cargo, no crew version of that vehicle first, right? So our typical process is you put up an uncrewed version of the vehicle, and then you do the crewed version of the vehicle. So the good news is that uncrewed, very first flight, Artemis 1, checked off the list. The other big thing that we tested was the entry. So the Orion vehicle came in at a different angle, different velocity, different trajectory than Apollo, right? Plus, the heat shield, different technology in terms of the very specific makeup of the material. And so one of the most important things about Artemis 1 was to test the heat shield, and the other one was the parachutes. And parachutes are really tough, right? And they're kind of a one-way deal. They work or they don't. You do a lot of testing to have, sort of one shootout type scenarios where something can happen. If you know anything about parachutes, the lines get tangled, they don't inflate, lots of complicated moving parts with parachutes that are a little bit unpredictable, right, based on the conditions that they are used in. And so testing the parachutes was another really, really big and important piece and necessary before we put our crew in the vehicle. So from our perspective, that 25 days, great success. Launch the rocket, fly Orion around the moon and back. It actually went about 40,000 miles on the other side of the moon. So someone actually was just asking me this question. If you go and look, and there's these really cool things on the internet, Apollo, right, if you had a circle, it kind of flew a tight trajectory around the moon, right? So not very far away from the moon on the backside, right, which in absolute distance from the Earth is the farthest we've been into the solar system, right? Our trajectory, and again, because it's different performance, and we're trying to get to the poles, which creates a different trajectory, 40,000 miles on the backside of the moon. And so much, much farther, again, in absolute distance. So that's the farthest a human-rated vehicle has been. And when our crew is in it for Artemis 2, then that will be the farthest from the Earth that humans have ever been. So think about that. All right. I gotta keep an eye on my time here. Let's see. So Artemis 2, here is our crew. Let's see, April 3rd. So what is today? Just like 10 days ago, 12 days ago, we announced the crew. It was awesome. We had so much fun, sharing it with the world. I know all 4 of these humans, and they are wonderful, wonderful people. One of the things that was really important to us as a NASA community, as an international space community, was that our crew is reflective of the world we live in and the world we want to live in. And so it's a pretty diverse crew from every sense of that word. And we're really, really excited about it. So my right, your left, Reed Wiseman, he's the commander, Navy pilot. Before that, he was the chief astronaut, so a lot of experience, great guy. He's flown in space to the International Space Station, so has human spaceflight experience. Next to him is Victor Glover, call sign Ike, so if I flip back and forth between Victor and Ike, then forgive me. And so also a Navy pilot, and he has flown to the space station as well, and he actually flew on the Crew Dragon, the Crew 1, here just in the last couple of years after we flew the original Crew Dragon. So he's got recent spaceflight experience and flying up on a commercial vehicle, right? And so from the crew's perspective, think about the vehicles. We try to design them with all of the basic systems, but it's like getting a car. Like if you rent a car and it's not your car, you get in, right? And you're like, how does my phone hook up, right? And so I just did this, right? And so this is one of the things that's really important to us. We can't make them all the same, right? The commercial companies and the international partners all have their perspectives about how things need to be done, but we do work really hard to make them compatible with each other so that the crews understand. So between this crew, they will have flown on the Soyuz vehicle, that the Russians take crew back and forth to the space station, the Dragon, the crewed Dragon vehicle, and then now on Orion, which is pretty amazing. So then you've got Christina Koch, also flown in space before. She is a scientist, so we're really excited about that. And then at the very end is our international astronaut on our Artemis II crew, Jeremy Hansen. And he is a rookie, first-time flyer. So you can imagine, like, the first time you fly in space, you get to go around the moon. I don't know, seems like a pretty good gig to me. So he is really excited about it as well. So these guys go into training immediately. They are super excited to get out and represent Artemis II for the launch that should be here, hopefully in just the next year or so. All right, so we were talking a little bit about going around to the backside of the moon, and so here's kind of a neat shot coming around. Artemis 1, one of the things that we were really excited about was sharing with the world all of the pictures. And so, many of you, right, spent a lot of time looking up. And so we're really excited about all of the things we were able to do. But with the crew on board, it'll be even better, right? We spent Artemis 1, had cameras, the GoPros, basically out on the ends of the solar panels. And so the Orion vehicle, it flies in a, sort of an X-wing fighter configuration, with the panels out, but then those solar panels actually hinge a little bit back as well. They do that actually for structural loads when you're going to do a burn and fire the engines and change your trajectory. But it ended up being really great for pictures because you could move them a bit, right? And so you had a little bit of freedom of what you could take pictures of. So I just put that one in for fun. All right, let's see. So talking about our crew, right? This is the entire astronaut corps we have at the moment. And this was also at the announcement. And it's funny because Joe Kaba, who's our chief astronaut, they gave me this laser pointer, and this is where I'm going to use it. Hang on. Joe, right there. He got up and he said, this is the most astronauts I've seen in one place in the entire time I've worked here. We got to take a picture. So that's where this picture came from. But we put it in, actually, because, again, back to just representing, again, the diversity of the world we live in today, it's actually a really great picture because you can see just almost everyone represented in it in some way. And so we're really, really excited, not only for the crew we have for Artemis II, but for the crews that are going to come after. So speaking of that, Artemis 3. So this is Nicole. She's not on the crew, although she would like to be yet, because we haven't named the Artemis 3 crew. This picture is here because we're going to start talking about landing on the moon. So 1, no crew, already done, check. 2, around our crew, farthest we've been. Those guys are raring to go. And the next mission is 3. There's a quiz after, by the way. It's underneath your chairs. I'm kidding. It's late in the afternoon. I got to keep you guys awake. Okay, so Nicole, so, Artemis 3, landing on the moon, right? And so that'll be the first time we have had boots on the moon in many, many, many years. What do we need in order to do that, right? We need a lander, right? Because we have our rocket, SLS, which you guys saw, we launched. Orion, our vehicle, transport vehicle, back and forth. And then we need a lander to get down to the surface. So our lander that we have contracted with is with SpaceX, right? Everyone's familiar with SpaceX. It's called Starship. And so if you're interested, they are going to try to do the first orbital test of that vehicle on Monday, is what the internet tells me. And so we'll see how it goes, right? It's the first time they've tried to launch it. But the Starship will be our lunar lander for our Artemis enterprise. This is not a picture of the Starship. This is a picture of stepping down on the surface of the moon. But the ladder is in there because Starship is really, really tall. And there actually is like an elevator that'll take them kind of down to the surface. So it's very different than the strategy we had for Apollo. The entire lander will go down, and the entire thing comes back up. If you remember Apollo, it went down, right, landed, and then they got back in the part on the top, and poof, it took off and left the base down on the surface of the moon. And so it's kind of a different strategy for how we're going to land on the moon, which will be, again, a sort of progress in terms of the capabilities that we have today. Okay, so the next piece of kind of Artemis is the Gateway Space Station. And so this is actually the part, I said in my intro, I spent 20 plus years in operations, so working on mission control. I think there's a picture in here later. And then about 10 months ago, I moved over to the development side, right? So if for many of you, you probably understand these terms in terms of life cycle, right? So I spent kind of my career at the end of the life cycle. People give you something, you figure out how to operate it. If you break, you got to figure out, how to make it work, keep the crew safe on orbit, working in mission control. And then so I just sort of jumped backwards in time. And now I'm learning all about the development side of the house. And so this is my project, which is called the Gateway. And it's a space station around the moon. A lot of interesting things about the space station. One, it's in an elliptical orbit around the moon. And so what does that mean, right? It means one side of the trajectory, it's really close to the moon, about 1,500 kilometers. And the other side of the trajectory, it's about 7,000, right? So it kind of looks like an egg going around. One of the reasons we did that is it's a mostly stable orbit around the moon, and so it doesn't require a lot of fuel and a lot of orbital maintenance burns in order to keep you in position. It's not perfect. We have to do some, but it's not a lot. And we do that orbit about 6.5, 7 days, right? If you look on the internet, it says 7, it's about 6.5. And so 2 parts to sustainability, right? One is down on the surface, and people think about the surface a lot, living and working on the surface. But the other part is living and working on orbit in deep space. Because if you want to go to Mars and beyond, that part is on orbit, right? So this is really kind of the complement to the surface piece around the moon, and actually will likely end up being our first piece of lunar permanence. So Gateway is comprised of a lot of different modules. The first 2 are set to launch here in about fall of 25, so October 25. And those 2 modules will actually go out on a commercial launch vehicle. So they're separated a bit initially from getting our Artemis 2 crew up and our Artemis 3 crew up. And that's actually good because they can get out and get on station, and then we will be able to visit the Gateway with Artemis 4. So for Artemis 4, the Orion vehicle will fly out to Gateway, and it will leave a couple of crew on Gateway and take a couple of crew down to the surface. So that means the lander has to dock to Gateway. We have to be able to take logistics to Gateway. So it's like an orbiting outpost that'll be crewed about a month or 2 out of the year, 30 days initially, and then we'll be able to expand that over time if we need to. And the rest of the time, it's up there flying autonomously. We're going to have a bunch of scientific instruments on it. The great thing about Gateway is that it is an international endeavor. So several of the modules are being built here in the US by prime contractors. Northrop Grumman and Maxar are 2 prime contractors here in the US. And then the European Space Agency is supplying a couple of modules. The Japanese Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency is building a robotic arm, just like they did for the shuttle and for our low Earth orbit International Space Station. And then we have plans to put an airlock here so you can do spacewalks on it. So all of that is going to be built up at the same time as we're working on the Artemis 2 and 3 missions, and we'll get up there so that we can meet for Artemis 4. So Artemis 4 is Orion to the Gateway Space Station, and then from there crew down to the surface. So we're starting to then see the permanent piece, because it will stay up there and have its elements attached in the next couple of missions, Artemis 5 and 6 and 7. And so it takes us about through Artemis 7 to get the humans on orbit, to get the landing done, and to get Gateway built out, right? And so when people refer to Artemis missions, that's where we are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, what's interesting, right, is again, Artemis Enterprise is all about building up all of this capability. And so there's a lot of talk right now about how to architect the surface. What do we want on the surface? How do we want to, I said it earlier, have things in a single point, like an Artemis base camp? Do we want to spread them around the moon? How would we do that? So there's a lot of work going on for the surface and building out the very creatively named ABC, Artemis Base Camp. Right, guys got that? Okay. So this right here is an example lander. I'm going to get to use my laser pointer again. Look at this. So much fun. And that is a design reference lander, right? That's, again, not the Starship. We are hoping, right, that we will get the opportunity to have another company come on board and build another lander. One of the things we really like to do in terms of sort of getting industry involved is multiple vehicles. So for our crew vehicles, right, low Earth orbit, the Dragon, and then Starliner is the other one that I haven't mentioned yet that is still going through the process of getting ready to fly its first crew. And so similarly, ideally, we'll have 2 landers available to us here in just the not too distant future. You can see the rovers, right? So we actually are working on 2 different types of rovers for the surface. One is a pressurized rover. If you kind of look in the back of the picture, right? And this is a drawing, right? Right here, though, you can see it's got volume, air inside, shirt sleeve environment. So pressurized rover, right? And then an unpressurized rover, and that one's kind of like what they used in Apollo in terms of driving around the surface of the moon, so that's what you've kind of seen before. The one thing I haven't mentioned, can anybody guess what else we need? We got a rocket, we got a transit vehicle, we got a space station. Okay, good. You guys are awake. Spacesuits, if you guys couldn't hear them. Definitely need spacesuits. And so just last year, it might have been earlier this year, actually, thinking about it. Early this year, we put on contract 2 spacesuit providers, Collins Aerospace and Axiom Space. And so they are both working on spacesuits for us. Axiom has the piece right now that will be these exploration suits, and they did a big reveal just several weeks ago as well. So, you know, if you roll back a year or 2 years, I have said to you that many of these things have come online just here, named a crew, got suits, got a lander, working on Gateway just in the last year or 2. And so back to the beginning, there's tremendous momentum with all of these different pieces and elements that are going to make up Gateway. All right, so there's me in mission control. Because one of the things I haven't mentioned yet is how does all this actually get wired together, right? So, you end up having prime contractors and the Kennedy Space Center working on the rocket, and then Orion, Gateway, the suits, thank you, and the lander, and then the surface elements. But what ties all this together is the mission control teams and the engineering teams that work around the world. So this picture was taken in Houston, which is where I live, in MCC Houston, which is kind of the hub, but there are many other control centers. Many of the prime contractors have their own. All of our international partners have control centers. And so beyond just the space vehicles and the hardware that you see, there is an entire infrastructure of engineers and operators who are working to build and wire this giant jungle gym together so that it all holds up when we go and put the crew. Because the crew is really the thread, right? They're the important part. When you start out, think about if any one of you, he wants to be our crew, I can tell. And so, he's launching, right? You need the ground system. Let's see if that picture is there. So ground system, bottom left, right? They take care of you, you go into quarantine, they feed you, they get you all ready to go. Then you've got your launch system, right? You're the piece that is common throughout all of it. You've got your spacecraft, right? You land on the surface. You've got your Gateway, where you have dropped off a couple of other crew who are going to live and work on Gateway. And you've got your navigation and communication system, which we haven't talked about yet, and we'll spend a couple minutes here in just a sec. Then you've got your suits and your Artemis Base Camp, right? So one of the things to take away from this presentation is how immense and far-flung and inclusive Artemis is across the U.S. and across the world. The challenge is, how do you make it all safe? All right. Uh-oh. Hang on. Thank you. Somehow the little clip came off. So I'm going to try to hold it. This could go badly. Okay. Oh, she's ground support. Oh, so good. You need to come and help. That was so good. Hold on. All right. Wherever that guy is, you're hired. So, okay. So good. Oh no, that's not, oh no. All right, so we're trying to figure out, how do you make it all safe for the crew, right? And we spend a lot of time thinking about it. If you consider, right, for fun, an emergency scenario on the surface of the moon, right? So we talked earlier, you can get home in like 4 to 6 hours from low Earth orbit from the International Space Station today, 4 to 6 days. And the surface of the moon is the most difficult case at the moment, because if you're on, sort of the wrong side of the moon, right? You've landed, you're out in a suit, you have an emergency, right? So today on the space station, then you just get back into the airlock, right? Which 30 minutes, right? We're supposed to be able to get back into the airlock. You're outside doing an EVA, you're in a spacesuit. 30 minutes. And then again, you could be home 4 to 6 hours if you need to, right? But if you're on the surface of the moon and you're out in a spacesuit and something happens, you gotta get back to your lander. And then you gotta get the lander off the surface, but you've gotta meet early, Artemis 3, you gotta meet Orion, which is circling, because that one doesn't include Gateway. Or later missions, Orion is docked to Gateway, waiting for you, so you gotta get back to Gateway. And either way, they're both in orbit, and you've gotta wait until the trajectory gets you there. So then from there, you gotta figure out the right point to do your burn, right? Undock from Gateway, and then head back to Earth, right? And so it's a pretty daunting thing to consider in terms of how to handle emergencies, how to keep the crew safe, when you have all these space vehicles that are being built, different phases and stages of development, and different teams around the world. And so that is, fundamentally what my job and the jobs of everyone working on it is to keep the crew safe, and be able to get them home, and be able to accomplish the mission. And so we say in operations, right, crew safety, vehicle safety, mission success. That's our mantra. Everybody has a mantra, right? So crew safety, vehicle safety, mission success. So those are the 3 things we run every decision we make through that algorithm in terms of if you're building hardware or software or testing or working in mission control. That's kind of our DNA. Let's see, so we haven't talked a little bit about communications, and I gave you that example because it's a bit of a segue, right? So communications are really interesting. Low Earth orbit, GPS. We can talk to the space station all the time if we want to. TDRS satellites, now we don't do it, other people use the TDRS, and every once in a while you get a little bitty zone of exclusion, right? I feel like I'm gonna knock this mic off again somehow. I can feel it falling, so you guys let me know. Yep. Something. Somehow it does not like me. But that's okay, it's ops, we'll just improvise, it's all good. So I'm gonna hold it this time. So zone of exclusion. So one of the interesting things about communications that we're talking about is, do you in fact need, relay satellites, that type of thing around the moon? Sort of the equivalent of, GPS. Now the Gateway, right, remember, in orbit, first piece, it has quite a bit of communication capability, but it's only one. So it's not going to make complete coverage, right? You need several to make a satellite constellation. 3, generally speaking, to kind of triangulate around the moon. 4 would be better. So there is a lot of discussion going on in the community about how we're going to do comm and how we're going to build it up over time. And in fact, there are some contracts that are in the works. There's a lot of commercial interest in figuring out how to do that as well, right? So I've talked a lot about the human spaceflight piece, but you got to consider as well, space in general is really, really busy. NASA has some lander programs, it's called CLIPS, which is uncrewed, unmanned, smaller compared to Starship, landers to the moon, that are taking payloads that are going through the works. One of those is supposed to launch later this year, maybe next year. And so there's an entire, again, thread of non-human vehicles that are being worked on that are going to support the entire ecosystem. One of the other things that's interesting is there's a small spacecraft, it's like the size of a bread box, called Capstone, that's actually in orbit around the moon in the same orbit that Gateway will be. So again, partnering with the other parts of the space community. And so it's flying the same orbit, right? And it has all its sensors, and those guys were just at the Johnson Space Center talking to us, last week. And so it is out there getting information for what it's going to be like to fly in that orbit. Things that we don't know, radiation, right? How quick is your orbit going to degrade? Because I told you it's not completely stable. So how much do you really need to correct? And so how much fuel do you need, right? Things like that are really, really important because, we understand flying in low Earth orbit and what it's like, what the environment is like, how fast your capability is going to degrade, your solar arrays, how much thermal you're going to get, what's your shadowing going to be like. But out at the moon, we've not ever done any of that. And so we have our models, and we have, Capstone as an example of the spacecraft that's flying out there, and the only one so far. And then that's what we got, right? So, again, when you hear Jerry talk about Apollo tomorrow, if you're able to go, we've a little bit come full circle in the space community where they did Apollo, and then we learned about low Earth orbit and the space shuttle and the space station and got pretty smart. Crazy stuff still happens, but for the most part, we know how to handle it. And then now we're sort of headed out into an area where certainly my generation has never flown spacecraft before. And so it's pretty exciting to get to do that. All right, we're going to wrap up. Why is the phone picture in here? Here's one of the huge differences between Apollo and where we are today, right? So the world and our ability to share information and transfer information and the interest is very, very different, right? So this community, what you do every day, right? The astronomy component that many of you are excited about, right? You have the ability, there are apps. More people go and look at the stars. My son was on a scout camping trip, and literally tonight they're like using the apps on their phones, like navigating with the stars. Like it's now incorporated into their orienteering type of thing, right? So, you guys have the ability to impact what you love to do, and so do we. The world is really excited and interested and watching. And so much of this is done with taxpayers' dollars, right? And certainly even countries that are funding their international components as well. And so one of the things that's really important to us and we're really excited about is to be able to share it with everyone, with all of you and the entire world as we go through this process. Now the challenge is you get to see all the little details and the warts here and there, right? But at the same time, we think it's really, really important. When we launched Bob and Doug into space, right, so that's low Earth orbit, the Dragon, first commercial crew, I was sitting next to the PAO person on console mission control, and I looked down at him, and he said, there are 10 million people logged into the live stream right now. 10 million, right? And so, that was Bob and Doug and low Earth orbit. Can you just imagine what it's going to be like when we launch Tonto and Ike and Christina and Jeremy, right? So it's really, really exciting. I'm going to say one last thing on this slide, right? Artemis Accords are a thing that we are trying to put together through friendly countries all over the world. And so hopefully, right, we will all be on the surface of the moon just like this together in not too distant future. So very last slide.